Hello, hello, hello,
Hello. Hi everyone. Well, today's been a bit of a wash. I started bright and early this morning, got to church about 2 hours early and had a video idea, and then technology ran me over. First phone problems and then laptop problems and Wi-Fi problems. I think it wasn't a total wash, since the lesson of the day is never use church Wi-Fi to try to upload a YouTube video. Don't do it. And hopefully I've solved some of my tech issues now, so that'll make it easier. All right, before my phone wonked out, I finished the first point in a thought about how to help people who are struggling conveying emotion and human behavior and mannerisms in art and in comics. And I started by talking about Jane Austen and her way of talking about human emotion and human speech, human mannerisms, and I was about to move on to Charles Dickens. So obviously he's an immensely influential author in the history of the English language. So all I'm going to say is essentially that Charles Dickens, I think, had the imagination of a cartoonist. And when he wrote novels, and described these unusual characters, he was really describing cartoon characters. I believe he was heavily influenced by the illustrator he commonly worked with. So, for example, David Copperfield, the villain of David Copperfield, is Uriah Heep. And Uriah Heep is described as an eel, squirming and wriggling around like an eel. Now, there have been actors who have portrayed, sorry about that. There have been actors who have portrayed the characters in David Copperfield and have portrayed these somewhat cartoonish, larger-than-life characters. But how do you, as an actor, portray a man who is described as an eel? It's a bit beyond what's realistic. It's a bit beyond what's normal. And so what I do when I read works of fiction is I will have a sketchbook at hand. Either I've got the book in one hand and the sketchbook immediately next to me to draw as I read, or I'm listening to an audiobook and drawing continuously. And the idea is you are taking notes on how the author is affecting your imagination. You're more than doing finished, polished drawings. You are note-taking your imaginative process, and you're learning from the author what they observe about human expression and human behavior. Uriah Heep, I think, is kind of maybe the most famous example of sort of Dickens' cartoonish imagination. And the second example I'm thinking of is Little Dorrit. Little Dorrit is one of his Little Dorrit is one of Dickens' less popular novels, and it's my favorite of his novels. It has had a BBC adaptation, and while I love the BBC adaptations of Dickens, I think they missed some of the key themes of this book. So, first character in Little Dorrit, who I think could inspire you a bit, is Little Dorrit herself. Little Dorrit is described as someone who is small and childlike, but she's actually about 20 to 22 years old. Yet her physical appearance, her height and her delicacy is more akin of like a 12-year-old or 13-year-old girl. And my personal interpretation is I think Little Dorrit was intended to be a Christ metaphor. She sacrifices herself and constantly works on behalf of her family, and her family are essentially leeches upon her. It's a toxic relationship. They rely on her completely, and they never show her gratitude for the work she does to benefit her family. Furthermore, she's a kind and caring person, and this sort of natural, pure kindness defines every relationship that she has. She has a relationship with Maggie, who is essentially, I think, probably a young lady who's suffered from brain damage, and looks at Little Dorrit as a mother, even though Maggie is older and larger than Little Dorrit. Little Dorrit is in love with the main male protagonist, Arthur Clennam, but he does not notice that Little Dorrit has affections for him. This goes over his head, in part because I think he has a protective mentality towards Little Dorrit. He sees her as a little girl and not as a woman, a grown woman. And this causes trouble for Arthur Clennam until he kind of gets his act together and he realizes that Little Dorrit is the person for him. And I think Little Dorrit's character is that of a pure and caring person who cares for everyone in her life, needing someone to take care of her and needing to rescue her from a toxic relationship. Now, when the BBC adapts this, of course, that's not very progressive. That's not a very good feminist archetype. So I got the feeling that they changed the character essentially to make her a bit more of a tough, stick up for herself, won't take no nonsense type of character. When the tragedy of the character is that she suffers on behalf of her family and never resists the mistreatment she receives from her family. So Little Dorrit, but the characters within Little Dorrit who I think most illustrate my point are two of the side characters. Their names are Panks and Mr. Casby. Panks and Mr. Casby. When they are introduced, Mr. Casby is the landlord of Bleeding Heart, I think it's Bleeding Heart Square, and he is described as someone who is like a Moses figure. He's like a patriarch from the Bible. He has long flowing white hair and he looks like a wise and sweet old man. And Panks is literally described as a tugboat. He snortles and he snuffles and he shuffles around. How does a tugboat move? How does a person who is like a tugboat walk around? So what Dickens is doing is he can't laboriously describe for you every little movement of Panks, but he's giving you a very powerful metaphor to create in your mind an almost unrealistic cartoon character, Panks. And what you discover about these characters is that first appearances are deceiving. Casby looks like a sweet, wise old man. He's actually a very foolish and very money-grubbing fellow. And Panks is the one that everyone blames for their troubles because Panks collects the rents for Casby, and he has the look of someone who's kind of mean and grubby and weird, kind of a weirdo. He has kind of a grimy tugboat. He's a tugboat. He looks like a dirty, smelly little boat, right? He's so weird. But then you find out that he's actually a very earnest and very kind man who is incredibly influential in the characters, the main characters being rescued essentially from the social conditions that Dickens was commenting upon. Not Bleak House. Little Dorrit is largely a comment on the debtor's prison system, but it uses very unusual one-dimensional characters who are still earnest and still have human passion. I call them one-dimensional characters not as an insult, but essentially because Dickens' characters have very strange mannerisms and names and ways of conducting themselves that create a very strong impression upon you, but they don't necessarily grow and become dynamic and change over the course of time. So now let's do the comparison and contrast. On the one hand, you have Jane Austen with these very realistic, she tells rather than shows, and I think that's good. You heard me right. She tells rather than shows. When the cliche is in writing, show don't tell, and obviously this is a good idea. You don't want to say to the reader, Bruce Banner got super mad and then he was sad. You want to show the reader that by maybe having Bruce Banner yell, "Dang it, Rick," and he slams his fist on the table and then his fist starts trembling, right? I don't need to tell you that Bruce Banner was mad and then he was sad. You can figure that out for yourself based on the information I've given you, the clues I've given you, and that's exciting to read. Now, in Jane Austen's case, why do I say that tell rather than show is good? Because it would take her 10,000 pages to tell you a story about British life in British social circles if she had to illustrate everything visually. If Mrs. So-and-so thinks Mr. So-and-so is a twit, Jane Austen will say, you know, Mrs. So-and-so had little regard for Mr. So-and-so. If you had to show it in a movie or a play, you'd have to have several scenes of Mr. So-and-so being a twit and Mrs. So-and-so giving maybe kind of caustic remarks. So it takes more time to establish those kinds of things. And Austen has the benefit of quickly establishing many types of characters and character dynamics by simply describing what's going on. I think Pride and Prejudice's famous opening words are the best illustration of this. I don't have it memorized, but it's a truth universally acknowledged that a wealthy young man is in want of a wife, and that is an abstract way of introducing you to the entire social setting where Pride and Prejudice takes place. It's a truth universally acknowledged by young women who are looking for dashing young men to marry, that any rich man who's single, well, he must want a wife. So, all right, so I've made the comparison and the contrast between Austen and Dickens. You know, and the main point is, if you read these for yourself, you're going to see how they have very different ways of looking at the world and establishing their characters. Now, if you do what I do, and you have the sketchbook right next to you, and you draw every character as they enter, when the author describes something unusual about them, try to convey that. And what you're going to find is that Austen and Dickens have very, very, very different ways of seeing people, and you are benefiting from both of their perspectives. In this example I've given, you could learn subtlety from Jane Austen, and you could learn dynamic exaggeration from Charles Dickens. So this is a piece of life advice you could use for any book that you like. I'd really encourage you to stretch yourself and maybe pick a book that's a few grade levels higher than what you're used to. And sometimes that means some of it goes over my head and I don't really understand it, but it always affects my imagination. And constantly drawing as your imagination is being affected is a learning process for you. I think I've got it. All right, guys, this is awesome. I really want to help people who want to make art make more art. So talking about comics and the state of the comics industry is something I'm interested in related to that, but I think I've nailed what my focus is. So I'm going to shoot for making an actual art critique. You know, this is stream of consciousness number 3 or 4 right now. So I said in my first video, I think I'll need to make stream of conscious videos once in a while, and what I'm realizing is maybe stream of consciousness, for at least for the time being, maybe the bread and butter of this channel until I nail down what my thesis is, and then hone that thesis, and then really get focused. But I'll try to get an art critique up tonight so you can get an idea of what I'm doing while reading comics. Peace. Catch you all later.